I'm sorry, it's declined.
Put it on this. What is going on with this?
This is not the place.
Give me the card. Give me the card.
You really should have asked what that card was connected to.
The fluorescent lights above the checkout lane hummed the way they always did on a Tuesday evening, indifferent to the small catastrophe unfolding beneath them. Sloane Ellington stood with both hands resting on the handle of her card, watching the young cashier swipe her card a second time. The girl's name tag said Priya. Her expression had already shifted from polite to apologetic to something closer to dread. "I'm sorry, ma'am." It's saying declined again. Sloane didn't flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that flinching only fed the moment. "That's all right. Try it once more." Behind her, Kendrick exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp enough to draw a glance from the woman in line behind them. He was still in his work clothes, tie loosened, the particular tightness around his jaw that Sloane had come to recognize as the beginning of something ugly. "It's not going to work the third time either, Sloane." His voice wasn't loud. Not yet, but it carried the practiced edge of a man performing patience for an audience he hadn't acknowledged was there. "I have another card," she said quietly, reaching for her bag. "Why do you need another card? Where did the money from last week go?" The question landed with more weight than it should have. Not because it was cruel, but because of how casually he asked it, as if she were a teenager who'd blown through an allowance. Priya's eyes flicked between them, then down at the register, suddenly very interested in the receipt paper. Sloane kept her voice even. "Kendrick, not here. There's never a good place, is there?" He stepped closer, and something in the line behind them went still, the particular stillness of strangers pretending not to listen while listening completely. "You know what this looks like? It looks like I work 60 hours a week, so you can stand here and embarrass me in front of people." "I'm not embarrassing you. You're standing at a register with a card that doesn't work, telling me it's fine." "That's not fine. That's the fourth time this month." It wasn't the fourth time. It was the first. But Sloane had stopped correcting him months ago, had learned that correction only extended these moments rather than ending them. So she said nothing in her silence, which she meant as restraint. Kendrick read his guilt. He held out his hand. "Give me the card." "Kendrick, give it to me." She placed it in his palm because refusing would have made a scene, and making a scene had never been the plan. What happened next was not. He looked at it for a moment. A plain navy card, unremarkable, no elaborate logo, nothing to suggest it was anything other than an ordinary piece of declined plastic. And then, with both hands, he snapped it in half. The sound was small, a dry crack, almost nothing, swallowed instantly by the store's ambient hum, but seemed to travel further than it should have. Priya's mouth opened slightly. Somewhere behind them, a phone rose, angled, recording. The woman in line whispered something to the man beside her. Sloane looked down at the two halves of plastic in Kendrick's hand, then up at his face. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She felt, more than anything, a strange and total stillness settle over her. The stillness of a door quietly closing after being left open for a very long time. "You really should have asked what that card was connected to," she said. Kendrick laughed, a short, incredulous sound, the laugh of a man who believed he'd just won something. "What is that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer. She picked up her purse, left the cart of groceries exactly where it stood, and walked out of the store into the parking lot's blue evening light, her heels clicking evenly against the concrete, unhurried, as if she had somewhere important to be and had simply remembered it. Kendrick stood at the register another moment, the two halves of the card still in his hand, feeling, for reasons he couldn't yet name, the first cold thread of something he would later recognize as fear. He didn't know it yet, but he had just made the smallest mistake of the worst week of his life. 3 days later, he would understand exactly what that card had been attached to. And by then, it would already be too late to take any of it back. If you've ever sat across from someone who stopped fighting for you before you noticed they'd left, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This one's going to matter. To understand what happened in that parking lot, you have to go back 5 years to a version of Sloane and Kendrick who hadn't yet learned to disappoint each other. They met at a fundraising gala and neither of them wanted to attend. Kendrick had gone because his firm required junior associates to make appearances at events where donors might remember their faces. Sloane had gone because Odessa insisted family obligations, however tedious, were still obligations. She wore a plain gray dress that cost less than the centerpieces on each table. She stood near the edge of the room, half hidden behind a pillar, nursing a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of finishing. When Kendrick approached her with the particular confidence of a man who had rehearsed his opening line twice in the mirror. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said. "Is it that obvious?" Only to someone who feels exactly the same way. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment above his father's hardware store, about clawing his way through law school on loans and part-time work, about the particular hunger of watching men his age inherit what he had to build stone by stone. She listened in a way that made him feel, for the first time in years, like a person and not a resume. She told him almost nothing about herself. Not because she was hiding a lie, but because she was protecting a truth, one she'd learned through painful experience, changed the way people looked at her the moment they learned it. "What do you do?" he asked. "I manage a few small investments for my family," she said, which was true in the way an ocean is technically a body of water. He didn't push. He liked that she was modest. He liked, even more, that she seemed genuinely uninterested in his prospects, his trajectory, the corner office he was certain awaited him. Every other woman he'd dated had asked, within the first month, where he saw himself in 5 years. Sloane never asked at all. She asked what made him laugh as a child. She asked what he was afraid of losing. They married 18 months later in a small ceremony that Kendrick's mother cried through and Sloane's grandmother watched with an expression no one could quite read: pride, wariness, and something that looked almost like grief. For the first 2 years, Kendrick loved his wife the way a man loves the one good decision he's certain he's made. He didn't need to understand her fully to appreciate her. There was a peace in their small house, in her quiet competence, in the way she never once made him feel less than enough. It was his career that began to unravel the piece, thread by thread. He watched colleagues younger than him step into partnerships he'd been promised were still years away. He watched friends from law school buy houses in neighborhoods he could only drive through. He began to notice, with a bitterness he didn't yet recognize as dangerous, that ambition alone did not appear to be enough, that some men simply had doors open for them that remained, for reasons he couldn't explain, closed to him. He never once considered that the doors closing around him were closing because his wife had spent years quietly making sure they never opened through her. Odessa Ellington's house sat on 11 acres of coastal land that had been in the family for 3 generations, a white clapboard structure that from the road looked no larger or grander than any of its neighbors. This was intentional. Everything about Odessa was intentional. Sloane had spent most of her childhood summers there, sent by parents who traveled constantly for reasons she understood only much later. Her mother sat on 4 different boards. Her father managed international acquisitions for a holding company few outside certain circles had ever heard of, and both of them believed, with Odessa's full agreement, that a child should not be raised inside the machinery of wealth before she understood what the machinery was for. Odessa taught her granddaughter to garden before she taught her anything about money. She taught her to mend a hem, to change a tire, to sit with grief without trying to fix it. It wasn't until Sloane turned 16, sitting on the porch one August evening with the smell of salt and cut grass in the air, that Odessa finally opened the door to what the family actually was. "You come from something larger than yourself," Odessa told her. In the plain, unhurried way she said everything important. "The Ellington Meridian Trust isn't just money, Sloane. It's leverage, influence, the kind of power most people never see because it doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly. It always has. Why are you telling me now? Because soon you'll be old enough for people to want things from you without you understanding why." Odessa turned her granddaughter's chin gently with 2 fingers, the way she had when Sloane was small and needed to look her in the eye. "I need you to remember 3 things, and I need you to remember them for the rest of your life." She held up one finger. "Never confuse wealth with worth. The two have nothing to do with each other, no matter what anyone tells you." A second finger. "Never reveal everything you possess. Not because you should live in shadow, but because what people don't know, they can't use against you, and they can't perform for it either." A third. "Watch how people treat those they believe are powerless. They will tell you everything you'll ever need to know about their character, more than their words ever will." Sloane carried those 3 rules the way other women carried inherited jewelry, quietly, constantly, without ever needing to take them out to know they were there. She didn't hide her identity from Kendrick because she intended to deceive him. She hid it because before him, 3 different men had learned who she was and become, almost overnight, entirely different people, attentive in ways that felt less like love and more like investment, generous in ways that felt less like affection and more like positioning. She wanted, more than anything, to be loved by someone who had no idea what loving her might one day be worth. When Odessa formally passed control of Sloane's portion of the trust to her at 26, 2 years into the marriage, Sloane changed nothing. She kept the modest house. She kept driving the aging sedan. She let her husband believe, because it was easier and because some stubborn, hopeful part of her still wanted it to be true, that they were building something together from nothing. She had no idea, not yet, how much that quiet decision would eventually cost them both. Marlo Pierce joined Kendrick's firm the same month he made senior associate, and from her first week, people noticed her the way people notice weather changing. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. She was sharp in meetings, generous with praise that always seemed to land exactly where it would do the most good, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she was, by every metric the firm measured, more talented than most of the men above her. She and Kendrick were assigned to the same acquisitions team within a year, and within 2, they had developed the particular closeness of colleagues who worked long hours together and mistook exhaustion for intimacy. That IT began the way these things always begin, with complaints disguised as conversation. "You should be a partner by now," Marlo told him one night, the 2 of them alone in a conference room at 9 p.m., surrounded by the debris of a deal that had run long. "Everyone says it. You outwork half the partners here. Outworking doesn't seem to be the metric that matters." "No," she said it gently, like she was breaking difficult news. "It's connections. It's who backs you. It's the doors that open before you even knock." She let that sit a moment before adding, almost carelessly, "You could have so much more, Kendrick, if you weren't carrying someone who doesn't understand ambition." He didn't answer her that night, but the sentence lodged itself somewhere he couldn't dislodge it, and over the following months, it grew roots. He began coming home later, telling himself it was the workload and not the ease of Marlo's company, the way she made him feel like a man on the verge of something instead of a man standing still. He began noticing, with a critical eye he hadn't turned on his wife before, the ordinariness of their life, the modest kitchen, the 10-year-old car in the driveway, the dinners that never included anyone useful to know. "You never want to entertain," he said to Sloane one evening, an accusation, dressed as an observation. "Half the partners' wives host something every month. You could build relationships that matter." "I build the relationships that matter to me," she said. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She didn't know it. She knew exactly what he meant, and she said nothing because there was no version of the truth she could offer him that wouldn't detonate the careful, ordinary life she'd spent years building, a life she still, despite everything, wasn't ready to give up. The emotional affair became a physical one, the way water eventually finds every crack in a foundation. Not suddenly, but inevitably, once the structure has already been compromised long enough. Sloane didn't discover it through a dramatic confrontation or a found text message. She discovered it the way wives sometimes do, in the accumulation of small absences, a scent that didn't belong to her on a jacket, a phone turned face down on the counter, a warmth in her husband's voice on calls he stepped outside to take. She didn't confront him. Instead, in the weeks that followed, she began, quietly and without ceremony, to separate her life from his. Not out of vengeance. Not yet. She simply stopped waiting for a marriage that had already ended in every way that mattered, long before either of them said so out loud. It's worth pausing here to say, if any part of this story has already made you feel something, drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I want to know if this is hitting the way I hope it is. The video from the grocery store took 11 hours to find its first 100,000 views. It took another 6 for someone in the comments to zoom into the frame where the card, for a fraction of a second before it snapped, caught the overhead light. Long enough to make out a small embossed insignia most people scrolled past without a second thought. It took a genealogy-obsessed corner of the internet, the kind that exists to trace the smallest threads back to something larger, less than a day after that, to connect the insignia to a private banking division that served almost exclusively clients associated with old and deliberately quiet money. By the time Kendrick arrived at the office 3 days later, jaw tight, coffee untouched, the video had crossed 2 million views, and the comments beneath it had shifted from mockery to something closer to fascination. Who is she? Look at how calm she is. The man has no idea what he just did. He told himself it would pass. Things like this always passed. He told himself, more than once that morning, that Sloane had left the house before he woke and hadn't answered his texts, and that this too, like everything else lately, would eventually blow over if he simply gave it time. He was still telling himself that when Bennett Rowe, the managing partner who had signed Kendrick's original offer letter 9 years earlier, appeared in the doorway of his office wearing an expression Kendrick had never seen on him before. "Close the door," Bennett said. Kendrick closed it. The Hartwell acquisition. Bennett didn't sit. He rarely sat when something was wrong. "We spent 4 months on it. Legal cleared it Friday. This morning I get a call from the Ellington Meridian Trust's office informing us the deal is under review." Kendrick felt something cold move through his chest, though he couldn't yet name why. Under review, for what reason? They didn't say. They don't have to say. They hold enough of the downstream financing that if they pause, we pause. It's the largest deal this firm has touched in 3 years, Kendrick, and it just went quiet for no reason anyone can explain. Maybe it's unrelated. Maybe. Bennett's eyes narrowed slightly. The particular look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. "Do you know a woman named Sloane Ellington?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a great height, and for one full second, Kendrick could not make his mouth work at all. "No," he heard himself say. "Why would I know her?" Bennett studied him a moment longer than was comfortable, then reached into the folder in his hand and slid a printed photograph across the desk without a word. Kendrick looked down. It was a still frame, slightly grainy, clearly pulled from video. A woman standing at a checkout counter, her hand outstretched, a man beside her holding 2 broken halves of a navy blue card. It was Sloane. It was him. "Care to try that answer again?" Bennett said quietly. "Before I have to explain to the board why one of our senior associates lied to my face about the woman whose family may be about to end this firm's biggest deal in years." Kendrick stared at the photograph, at his own hand frozen mid-motion, at his wife's calm, unreadable face beside it, and understood, with a slow, sickening certainty that seemed to rearrange every memory of the last 5 years in real time, that he had never actually known who he married at all. He opened his mouth to answer, and found, for the first time in his life, that he had absolutely nothing to say. The silence in Bennett's office stretched long enough that the hum of the building's ventilation became the loudest thing in the room. Kendrick looked at the photograph again, as though staring at it long enough might change what it showed. "I need you to understand something," Bennett said finally, sliding into the chair across from him now, his earlier sharpness softening into something more careful. "I'm not asking as your boss right now. I'm asking as a man who's about to walk into a boardroom and needs to know exactly what he's dealing with. She's my wife." The words came out smaller than Kendrick intended, stripped of the confidence that usually carried everything he said. "But I didn't know any of this. She never told me her family had." He gestured vaguely at the photograph, unable to finish the sentence. "Had what, Kendrick? Do you even know what you're gesturing at?" He didn't. That was the problem. He had spent 5 years married to a woman he now understood, with the force of a physical blow he had never actually seen. He left the office an hour later with instructions to say nothing, do nothing, and wait for Bennett to determine the scope of the damage. He drove home without remembering the drive at all, and when he walked through the front door of the house he'd spent months quietly resenting for its ordinariness, he found it exactly as he'd left it that morning. Sloane's coffee cup still sat rinsed in the drying rack. Her reading glasses were folded on the side table. Nothing about the space suggested anything extraordinary had ever lived inside it. That, he realized now, had always been the point. He spent the next 2 days doing what he should have done years earlier and never thought to. He searched public filings, old news archives, court records buried in county databases that hadn't been touched in over a decade. What he found rearranged the architecture of his entire adult life. The Ellington Meridian Trust held positions, some direct, most layered through holding companies with names that meant nothing on their surface, across real estate, private equity, healthcare logistics, and financial services spanning 4 continents. It had quietly funded infrastructure projects in cities that never printed the family's name in a single press release. It held minority stakes, acquired decades ago and never divested, in companies whose names Kendrick recognized immediately because he had spent his career trying to work inside their orbit. And buried in a decade-old profile from a regional business journal, half forgotten and never updated, was a single line that made Kendrick set down his laptop and sit very still for a long time. Sloane Ellington, granddaughter of Odessa Ellington and controlling beneficiary of the Ellington Meridian Trust, has largely stepped back from public involvement in family holdings. Controlling beneficiary. Not an heir waiting in line. Not a name on a family tree included for completeness. The person who, when it mattered, held the final word. He thought of every promotion he'd credited to his own relentless effort. He thought of the mentor who'd taken an unusual interest in him during his 3rd year. A partner at a firm 2 rungs above his own who'd since become, Kendrick now discovered with a nauseating jolt, a longtime advisor to one of the trust's holding companies. He thought of the Hartwell deal itself, the deal he'd spent 4 months building his entire year around, and the account only now occurring to him. That the financing behind it traced back through 3 layers of shell entities to money that ultimately answered to his wife. He had spent 5 years believing he'd built something from nothing, brick by exhausting brick, while resenting the woman beside him for not helping him build faster. She had spent 5 years making absolutely certain he never found out he hadn't needed her help at all, because she'd wanted, more than she'd wanted almost anything, for him to be a man who never had to ask. The cruelest part, the part that sat in Kendrick's chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge, was realizing that the version of himself he'd resented Sloane for holding back had never actually existed. She hadn't been holding him back. She'd been the only person in his life who'd wanted him to become something real rather than something inherited. He didn't know, yet, if that realization would matter at all. If you've ever discovered that someone you loved was protecting you in ways you never noticed, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the boardroom is going to change how you see every quiet person you've ever underestimated. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, in a conference room on the 42nd floor that Kendrick had occupied dozens of times without ever once feeling the particular dread that settled into his stomach as he approached its glass doors this time. Bennett had told him almost nothing in the 2 days since the photograph, only that the Ellington Meridian Trust office had requested his presence at the final discussion regarding the Hartwell acquisition, and that Kendrick's continued employment likely depended on how the next hour unfolded. He arrived early. He straightened his tie twice in the elevator's reflective doors. He told himself, with the particular desperation of a man rehearsing an apology he didn't yet know how to give, that he would find a moment, some private moment before the formalities began, to speak with Sloane, to ask her, finally, the questions he should have asked 5 years earlier. That moment never came. The doors opened at precisely 10 o'clock, and the room, already filled with senior partners and 2 members of the board Kendrick had only ever seen in company-wide emails, rose to its feet in a single unified motion, the way people rise for someone whose presence changes the temperature of a room. Sloane walked in wearing a simple black dress, unremarkable by any objective measure, The kind of dress a woman might wear to an ordinary Tuesday meeting. No jewelry beyond a small woven bracelet on her left wrist. The kind of thing that might have come from a market stall rather than a vault. She looked, Kendrick thought, with a fresh wave of vertigo. Exactly like the woman he'd married. Exactly like herself. Calderwin walked a step behind her, silver-haired and unhurried. The particular calm of the man who had spent 4 decades making sure other people's chaos never became his own. "Ms. Ellington," Calder said, gesturing her toward the head of the table with the ease of long practice. "The team is ready for you." Every person in the room remained standing until she sat. Every person, that is, except Kendrick, who found that his legs had simply stopped working, that he was frozen in his chair at the far end of the table, watching his wife take a seat of authority in a room that had spent his entire career reminding him he hadn't yet earned one. Sloane's eyes moved across the table, unhurried, professional, and settled, for just a moment, on Kendrick. There was no triumph in her expression, no cruelty. If anything, what he saw there looked closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of someone who had carried something heavy for a very long time and was finally setting it down. The meeting itself lasted 40 minutes, and Kendrick absorbed almost none of it. He heard phrases pass back and forth across the table. Financing terms, reputational exposure, board confidence, without being able to hold onto any single one of them. He watched his wife speak with the calm precision of someone entirely at home in a room he had spent 9 years trying to earn a seat in, and he understood, with each passing minute, exactly how small his own ambition had been compared to the world she'd deliberately hidden from him. When a meeting ended and the room began to empty, Sloane remained seated a moment longer, gathering a folder Calder had left beside her. Kendrick, driven by something he couldn't name, desperation, shame, the last threadbare hope that there was still some version of an explanation that might undo the last 5 years, crossed the room before he could think better of it. Sloane. His voice cracked on her name in a way it hadn't since he was 23 years old. "Please, just explain this to me." She looked up at him, and for a moment, something old and tired passed across her face, something that might once have been love, worn down by years of quiet erosion into something closer to grief. "What exactly would you like me to explain, Kendrick?" "All of it. The house, the car, why you let me believe." He stopped, unable to finish, because finishing meant admitting the shape of everything he believed. "You spent 5 years trying to prove I wasn't enough," Sloane said quietly, no anger in her voice, which somehow made it worse than if there had been. "You never once asked what I already was." "I didn't know. You didn't want to know." She stood, smoothing the front of her dress, the small bracelet catching the light. "You wanted someone who made you feel important by comparison. I gave you that for a long time because I loved you, and because I believed for a while that you loved me too much to need it. I was wrong about the second part. I don't think I was wrong about the first." "Sloane, please. I'm not doing this to punish you," she said, cutting gently through what would have become a plea. "I want you to understand that. None of this was designed to humiliate you. You did that yourself, in a grocery store, in front of a dozen strangers, over a card that never mattered to me at all." She paused at the door, glancing back at him one final time. "I just stopped protecting you from finding out. That's all this ever was." She left him standing alone in the conference room, the city stretching out silver and indifferent through the windows behind him. And Kendrick understood, finally and completely, that there was no version of an apology large enough to reach the distance she had already crossed without him. The unraveling that followed wasn't loud. Sloane made certain of that. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't give interviews to the outlets that came calling once her name surfaced fully online. The video's view count climbing past 20 million as amateur investigators pieced together, with increasing accuracy, exactly who she was. She let Calder handle every inquiry with the same 3 sentences, delivered so evenly they became almost a kind of poetry. "Ms. Ellington has no comment." The family asked for privacy during this time. Any further questions may be directed to our office. The Hartwell acquisition was reassigned within the month, not out of malice, but because the board had lost confidence in the judgment of the associate whose personal conduct had become, however unfairly, inseparable from the firm's public reputation. Bennett delivered the news himself, with something that might have been genuine regret in his voice. "You were good at this job, Kendrick. I want you to know that. This isn't about talent. I know what it's about." Marlowe distanced herself with the efficient speed of someone recalculating a losing position. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final conversation. She simply stopped returning his calls, stopped appearing in the break room at the hours they used to overlap, and within 2 months had transferred to the firm's Chicago office entirely. Kendrick understood, watching her go, that she had never been building something with him at all. She had been positioning herself near whoever seemed most likely to rise, and the moment he stopped rising, she had simply, quietly, moved on to someone else. The marriage ended the way most marriages end, when one person has already left long before the paperwork catches up, quietly, through lawyers, over a period of months that felt both impossibly slow and shockingly fast. Sloane asked for nothing beyond what was fairly hers. She left in the house. She left him, in fact, more than most people believed a woman in her position would ever leave a man who had publicly humiliated her. And when Kendrick's own attorney remarked on it, bewildered, Sloane's only response, relayed secondhand, was simple. "I don't need anything from him. I never did." That was always the part he couldn't understand. Kendrick's greatest punishment was never the lost promotion, or the marriage, or even the video that would follow him, in smaller and smaller ways, for years. His greatest punishment was the quiet, permanent understanding that the one person in his life who had genuinely wanted him to succeed on his own merit had been the same person he'd spent 5 years accusing of holding him back, and that by the time he understood the difference, there was no longer anyone standing close enough to forgive him for it. If any part of this story has stayed with you tonight, if it's made you think about someone in your own life you might have misjudged or underestimated or failed to truly see, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what's the biggest lesson you're taking from Sloane's story? The coastal house looked exactly as it had when Sloane was 16 years old, sitting on the same weathered porch, listening to the same rhythm of water against rock that had taught her, long before any lawyer or accountant ever did, what patience actually meant. She'd returned there 3 months after the divorce was finalized, not to hide, but to remember. Odessa had passed 2 years earlier, peacefully, in the same upstairs bedroom where she'd once explained to a 16-year-old girl the difference between wealth and worth, and the house had passed to Sloane along with everything else. Though of everything the trust contained, this was the only inheritance that had ever actually felt like hers. She sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon light, the small woven bracelet loose around her wrist, the same one Odessa had tied there herself the summer Sloane turned 18, made from cowrie shells collected from this exact stretch of coastline over the course of a single unhurried August. A young girl from the fishing village down the road, 7 or 8 years old, wandered up the porch steps with the fearless curiosity children sometimes carry, holding a handful of shells she'd gathered from the tide line. "Is this your house?" the girl asked. "It was my grandmother's. Now it's mine." The girl studied her for a moment, taking in the modest porch, the plain cotton dress, the bare feet resting on sun-warmed wood. "Were you always rich?" Sloane smiled, the kind of smile that carried years inside it, and reached out to look at the shells cupped in the girl's small hands. "I was always loved," she said. "The money came later." The girl seemed to consider this with the particular seriousness children bring to answers they don't fully understand yet, then held out one of the shells, a small, perfect cowrie, pale and spiraled. "For your bracelet," the girl said, "in case you need another one someday." Sloane took it carefully, turning it over once in her palm before closing her fingers around it. "Thank you," she said. "I think I will." The girl ran back down toward the water, and Sloane remained on the steps a while longer, watching the tide pull slowly back from the shore, taking with it everything the day no longer needed and leaving behind, as it always did, only what mattered enough to stay. She thought, briefly, of Kendrick, not with anger, which had faded faster than she'd expected, and not quite with grief, either, but with something quieter, a kind of understanding. He had spent 5 years looking for proof of what he was worth in every place except the one that had been sitting across the dinner table from him the entire time. She hoped, distantly, that he would eventually learn what she had known since she was 16 years old, sitting on this same porch, listening to her grandmother explain the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered. That the people who love you without needing anything from you are the wealth. Everything else is simply what you do with it once you understand the difference. The tide kept moving. The light kept falling gold across the water. And Sloane Ellington sat exactly where she'd always belonged, not at the head of a boardroom table, not in the pages of a business journal, but here, on a porch her grandmother built, finally, completely herself.